Of all the films premiering at this year's edition of the Fantasia Film Festival, very few have piqued the interest of genre fans everywhere like Shelby Oaks, the featured directorial debut of YouTube film critic Chris Stuckmann, who also wrote and co-produced the film. It was recently snapped up for a theatrical release by Neon, who are riding high as a genre distributor following the success of Longlegs. Many of his fans are curious as to whether Stuckmann's on-camera criticisms translate into solid directorial chops. So what's the result? Sad to say, the hope that Shelby Oaks would be the next great horror debut were overblown. This is meant as no slight against Stuckmann, who I must admit I know next to nothing about. I've only seen a handful of his reviews, but he's always struck me as a nice, personable guy. So who is Chris Stuckmann? Unless you've been living under a rock, you know that he's one of the biggest critics here on YouTube, and now he's a director. But I've never really followed his career. I've encountered him a couple of times at different events, and he always seemed like a pretty personable guy. And I was reading a little bit about him, and his change from being a Jehovah's Witness to a film critic is actually quite compelling stuff. So I have to say, as an avid YouTuber myself, I was rooting for him to really be able to make this transition to the big screen. I know some people, are kind of thinking, he was a critic, how dare he become a director? But there have been great film critics that became directors, such as Rod Lurie, who made The Contender. And there's that guy, Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut. All those guys started out as film critics too for Le Cahiers du Cinéma, and they became pretty solid directors, so who knows? That said though, Stuckmann is no Godard, and he's certainly no Truffaut, and boy oh boy, he's not a Rod Lurie either. Everyone is probably expecting Shelby Oaks to be this kind of masterful directorial debut, given the fact that Neon bought it and they're planning a major theatrical release for it in 2025. But I have to say, as a horror critic, I've seen so many indie films, and first-time indie films as well, with lower budgets than this that are a million times better than what Shelby Oaks was. As the first film, Shelby Oaks isn't terrible, but the decision to give this a huge build-up and release seems to have been fully motivated by his internet notoriety. I've seen other low-budget horror outings that were much better than this and totally vanished without a trace, although kudos to Stuckmann for parlaying his internet fame into a burgeoning career as a director. To be sure, this is a tough film to review. The movie hinges on an interesting twist that occurs early in the film and changes things up in a big way. But everyone seeing it early has been asked not to reveal what that twist is. It's a solid reveal, and I certainly won't spoil it for you, dear JoBlo viewers, but it leaves me having to unpack a movie I really can't reveal all that much about. Shelby Oaks does take an interesting perspective on the found footage genre, with the movie hinging around Camille Sullivan's Mia, who is searching desperately for her paranormal investigator sister. While investigating a mysterious area called Shelby Oaks, she and her crew all vanished, with the horribly mangled corpses of her colleagues found soon after. However, the sister Riley was nowhere to be found, and everyone, including Mia's harried husband, Robert, played by Brendan Sexton III, who you may remember from Empire Records, and the cop investigating the case, Mayor of Kingstown's Michael Beach, think she's dead. Stuckmann clearly has a deep love for the genre, but there's honestly nothing here you haven't seen before. The debt it owes to the Blair Witch Project and Rosemary's Baby is palpable, and Stuckmann right now isn't a polished enough writer or director to really make Shelby Oaks a compelling watch. Some of the imagery here is groan-worthy, with Mia saying at one point how she and her husband wanted to start a family but were sidetracked, for 12 years mind you, by the case. How is this illustrated? By a clumsy recurring shot of a baby crib filled with investigative files. Oh boy. The switch from Mia to sleuth also seems to come out of nowhere, as does Robert's descent from a supportive husband to someone who thinks his wife is going off the deep end, despite obvious evidence that, hey, she actually is probably onto something. Stuckmann does what he can with his low budget, but the movie's biggest problem has nothing to do with limited resources. It's a film that commits the cardinal sin as far as horror movies go. What is that? It's simply not scary. I didn't jump once the entire time I was watching it. My arms of my chair in the theaters were not ripped at all. I was just sitting there sipping the beer that I snuck into the film, Coors Light Silver Bullet, I have to say. And I found it very tame and very tepid throughout. It could even get a PG-13, although there are some gore shots that maybe would make that a little bit tough. The film is based around Camille Sullivan's Mia, and she does what she can with a thinly written role. For much of the movie, her character seems one note, only for a late-in-the-game reversal that's hard to swallow and runs contrary to much of what we've seen before. The movie does benefit from a polished score by the Newton brothers, who frequently work with producer Mike Flanagan, but the film is so uneven that one wonders if Neon is planning to even out some of the rough spots before it eventually hits theaters. But here's the thing, the movie hinges around a big reveal that occurs fairly early in the film and totally changes the game. And Neon, of course, sent out an email afterwards saying that we are not allowed to talk about the big twist, or at least strongly advised not to. And fair enough, it's a really good one, and I don't want to ruin it for horror fans. That said, this is going to have to be a pretty vague review, because I honestly don't know what to say. without being able to dig into something that concerns a huge chunk of the film. It seems in some ways that Stuckmann is kind of isolating himself a little bit from criticism because we can't really dig into the film too much, because we're just not allowed to say much about it. And I have to wonder, as an internet film critic, would he himself have actually adhered to this embargo? I really don't know, because it leaves me in a difficult position where I have to basically review a film that I'm not really allowed to talk about. I'm not trying to say that Shelby Oaks is some kind of a train wreck. It isn't. I've certainly seen a lot worse films, even here at Fantasia. That said, I don't think it deserves the big push that it's getting from Neon. There are so many other films out there that, in my opinion, are more deserving of an audience than this one is. Stuckmann may have a good career ahead of him as a director, but right now he's kind of an amateur. You know, he's a writer, director, first-timer, and it shows in the movie as far as I'm concerned. I think he may one day become a pretty interesting writer and director. At the moment, I don't think he's there yet. This is the kind of film that I feel like I've seen a million times before. It's not terrible, but there's nothing particularly great about it either, which is why I give it a 5 out of 10.